You still want to talk to me about selling? I said, well, yeah, sure. Seems that what had happened was he had word around town that I was successful selling insurance. So he decided maybe I could come back and sell radio. Well, I went back to work for him as a salesman, and I had some level of success. But about this time, my father had met the owner of Rollins Broadcasting, which was building a station in Radford, Virginia, and some other places. And this man owned a chain of automobile dealerships. And my father told him that I was in radio, and he said, what does he do? He's a salesman. And Mr. Rollins said, I'd like to talk to him. Mr. Rollins was buying printing from my father, and he was in business in Radford, Virginia. And Mr. Rollins said, when he comes home, have him call me. And a week or two later, I was home for a visit, and I called Mr. Rollins, and he said, I'd like to talk to you. How about coming to my office now? This was a Saturday. We talked, and we made a deal. He was going to send me to Georgetown, Delaware as his sales manager because he was building a radio station in Georgetown, and he wanted somebody to sell. Well, in the interim between the time that I served my notice that I was leaving and going to work for him, he bought a radio station that was on the fast track for approval in Fayetteville. So on a Friday afternoon, he called me into the office and he said, I've just heard word from the FCC that the approval has taken place. I want you in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Monday morning at 8 o'clock, ready to go to work. Well, I was married. I had to leave a wife behind who was teaching school, but we worked out an agreement, and this was in March of 1951. I made the appointment at 8 o'clock, and I kept it. I went to work for the radio station and WFAI, and we had a small amount of business. 14 months later, I had quadrupled the business because Fayetteville is a very good business town. Anybody who lived in Fayetteville and had a chance to become part of Fayetteville learned very quickly it was a great place to do business. I went to work for Rollins, and I also learned that, one, I didn't want to run a radio station the way he did because he pushed people day and night. And the big bonus that I expected at the end of the year turned out to be $82. And I was starting to look for a place to work somewhere else. And one day downtown on Hay Street in Fayetteville, a man walked over to me and said, are you Tom Harrell? I said, yes. He said, I'm Victor Dawson. I'd never met the man, but I knew who he was because he owned and operated WFNC, the biggest station in town. He said, my sales manager, Tiny Martin, has just told me that he is leaving because he has to go home and look after his parents. Both are ill. I'd like to talk to you if you're interested. And I said, let's talk. He said, come over to my office. I said, well, I got some more people to see today, but as soon as I have seen them, I'll come. And I got over to his office about 6:30. And we talked for about an hour, and we struck a deal. And I went to work for Vic Dawson as his sales manager. That man asked me some questions which I have never forgotten. He said, what do you want to be doing 5 years from now? I said, I'd like to think I would be capable of managing a radio station. What do you want to be doing 10 years from now? I said, I'd like to think that I could own a station in 10 years. He said, you come to work for me, and I'll help you do it. I went to work for that man, and 3 years and 11 months later, he honored his word. Not only did I make enough money to put a down payment on WSTP in Salisbury, I took his chief engineer with me as a partner, and he was never upset about any of these things. He actually said to me that I will help you do it. And he turned out to be a coach, a mentor, a teacher. He gave me an opportunity to learn the very best there is to know about radio. And his father was Speaker of the House of Representatives in Raleigh, John G. Dawson, a very accomplished lawyer in Kinston. And the day that I worked my final day in October 1956 for him, his father came over and they had a little luncheon at the radio station, a going away party, and his father came from Kinston. I'd seen the man a couple of times, but he told me something that was the most helpful thing that a man could do. He said, I think you're going to do fine in Salisbury, but if anything goes wrong, I want you to remember this. You come back here, we will make a place for you. And I think about 30 tons was lifted right off, because I began to realize what I had done. I was walking away from a very comfortable job. I had purchased my own home. A lot of things had gone my way in the 4 years I worked for that man. But his father came in and just simply said, you know, I have the controlling vote in this radio station. My son here has 49%, my daughter has 49%, but I got the controlling 2% to tell them what to do. And if things don't go right in Salisbury, I will tell both of them that you're coming back to work here because you've done a great job for us. As I said, that lifted a lot of weight off of my shoulders, because I knew that if I failed, I wasn't going to go hungry. I could go back to a good job. Came to Salisbury in October 1956. We were all cramped up on the second floor of the Center Theater building in a space which was designed by somebody who really knew how to build a studio but didn't know much about office space or anything else except a studio. And what we had was a floating floor in the control room. You could walk into the control room, and I think if somebody shot a person in the outer office or even in the studio, it would not have been heard outside of that room. It was a great facility, and somebody had spent a lot of money, $18,000, to build that studio, and back in 1956 that was a ton of money. But I realized that I basically had to consolidate the radio station in one place in order to save the rent. So I decided, along with my two partners, Ted Austin and Jack Eichner, the engineer that came with me, that we needed to move to the transmitter building on Gregory Avenue, which is later named Statesville Boulevard. And so we did. We moved it into 900 square feet we had 900 square feet in the studio in the Center Theater building. But when we moved out there, discovered that, one, the water for the entire Center Theater building was being run through the radio station through cooling towers, and then was run through a system which cooled the air that was blown into the theater downstairs. Then I understood why the water bill was $150 a month. The next thing that happened was when we moved, we cut off the electric power, and we found out that we were furnishing the electric power for the second and third floor of the radio station, and we only occupied about half of the second floor. So we saved a lot of money on the power bill. And while I had the best CPA probably in Fayetteville go over the books very carefully to determine the condition of the advertising business, we discovered that 27% of all the business on the radio station was being double billed. Now that is a big time illegal no-no. You don't do that. So when people started calling and saying something was wrong with their bill, it wasn't what they thought it was to be, I wound up taking 27% of the business off of the radio station by the end of December of 1956. And that was a real blow. Unexpected, unanticipated. But we survived, and we found that we could compete in the market. It wasn't exactly what we thought. Salisbury was regarded as an old, stable, industrial city that had a strong base of listeners and advertisers around the Spencer shops of the Norfolk and, well, it's now Norfolk and Southern, but then it was the Southern Railroad. There was 2 or 3 other things about Salisbury that we liked. One, there were 2 colleges here at the time. The banks had almost $1 billion of deposits that they controlled at the local level, which means that you could most likely borrow money. The other thing that Salisbury had was 2 hospitals, a big VA hospital and a rather large locally owned hospital. So we had education, finance, and medicine. And that combination with the railroad and some other things that Salisbury had that were industries like Procter Chemical and the Peeler Bakery. There were, even the Salisbury Post had over 100 employees, as I recall, in those days. And a couple of other things were downtown, like Norman's Draperies, which employed a number of people. And that gave the town an economic base, because we had, the 3 of us had looked at radio stations in Florida, and there was 3 or 4 for sale, but half of the signal covered water. They were in beach towns like Vero Beach and Pompano Beach, and in the western panhandle in a place called Perry, which was a agricultural community near the Gulf Coast. And I was not really happy with the idea of having a signal that went places where there was no potential listeners. The thing that happened next was Salisbury was a forgiving town of listeners. They were intense listeners. They would call you up and tell you whenever you mispronounced a word. They wanted you to know something about the community, and we had a lot of people who listened and who were forgiving whenever we made those kinds of mistakes, and others similar. But one of the things we discovered was nobody was paying much attention to sports. And Ted Austin, the program director, had experience in that area, and so he decided we ought to be doing, we really ought to be doing sports. So we looked at the possibilities.
Sports, or?
Let's call this chapter the genesis of programming that we used at WSTP to separate ourselves from the other programming readily available in Salisbury and Rowan County. The partners that I came to town with, Jack Eichner was an engineer who had a long history in the business, as did Ted Austin. Ted Austin was the first man in the state to program a television station. That was Channel 2 in Greensboro. He was a good program director, and one of the things he realized is way we could make WSTP different was to go to local sports. And so he started out broadcasting the games